Japan in particular, as it's experiencing these economic troubles, also is feeling the pressure from the United States. But more recently, people forget that Russia's aggression today also has a peaking power origin. So in the 2000s, Russia was a resurgent economy. It was banging out roughly 8% annual economic growth rates, largely because all those commodity prices were very high. But then after the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of the prices for all the things that Russia was selling go down. They take down Russia's economy and Putin's popularity with it. He responds, first of all, by jailing more dissidents and dialing up anti-Western propaganda, but he also starts putting pressure on former Soviet states to join the Eurasian Economic Union, this customs union, where he basically says, I'm going to put tariffs around all of you so that it's harder for you to trade with the rest of the world, but you have to lower your tariffs with Russia and basically become economic vassals of the Kremlin. So needless to say, some Ukrainians were not so excited about that idea. They were much more interested in getting a giant trade deal with the European Union, and we know how that tug of war between Russia and the West has ultimately played out. So you see this pattern over and over again in history. It's the rapid rise followed by the fear of a potential decline if countries don't do something, that if you don't get moving, the international balance of power may eventually turn against you. And so when I look at China today, I see China doing three things that make me very concerned. First of all, China has been dialing up domestic repression. And I now use the term fascism. And I don't use that lightly because I know it's a loaded term. But if you look at what's happening in China today, a lot of the classic hallmarks of a fascist regime are starting to show themselves. So first of all, you have the worship of a central leader. If you listen to Chinese propaganda today, they celebrate Xi Jinping like he's the third pillar of this holy trinity. So they say under Mao, China stood up. Under Deng Xiaoping, China got rich. And under Xi Jinping, China is going to become mighty again. Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, I guess, are just forgotten. They're not even mentioned in this. But you see this extreme worship, and he has centralized power, of course, as no leader has since Mao. Another aspect is dialing up of hyper-nationalism, and not just like our country is great nationalism, but this idea of taking revenge on hostile foreign forces that disrupted the golden age of the nation, this golden age that the dear leader is going to eventually restore. You see these themes of national rejuvenation and recovering from the century of humiliation increasingly featuring in schools, in popular media, as well as in government documents. You also have the brutal repression of ethnic minorities. So Chinese documents increasingly describe the Uyghurs, other ethnic minorities, as a cancer that has to be cut out of the system before it infects the rest of the body politic. And you've seen the extreme measures that China has gone to in order to control these minority populations, the re-education camps, the bulldozing of traditional communities, and so on. You also have the development of this Orwellian surveillance state that can just track massive populations and then discipline people instantly by, if you do something wrong, maybe getting cut off from travel. And then if worse comes to worse, you can just send in the traditional authorities to crack heads. And then finally, this worship of military strength. And it's not just the parades and the goose stepping, it's more subtle things like the civil-military fusion concept, which is explicitly designed to erase the boundaries between civilian and military life. Any organization, any company can essentially be commandeered to serve the nation in a geopolitical or military sense. So at the same time, China also is developing a new economic strategy. And it seems to be one that is prioritizing leverage rather than just rapid growth. So I think the basic idea is, okay, our economy is not going to grow as fast as it did, but we can still get leverage over our trade partners by dominating what Chinese documents call the choke points of the global economy. So these are things that other countries can't live without, whether it's medical PPE or rare earths or certain types of computer chips or access to the South China Sea. There are certain strategic industries that China is looking to dominate, and you see that China pairing that with an increased willingness to impose sanctions on other countries. So for example, Australia calls for an investigation into where COVID came from, and China uses its economic leverage to basically wage a trade war against Australia. Now the Australians, in typical Australian fashion, kind of react with good humor. They sponsor this fight communism by buying Australian wine campaign, and then parliament members in other Western democracies kind of pick this up, and it's this sort of patriotic thing. But it shows that China is much more willing to adopt a mercantilist strategy to flex its muscles in reaction to the fact that it can no longer just buy off other countries through promises of rapid growth by partnering with China. And then finally, what worries me the most is this big military buildup. So China is engaged in the largest peacetime military buildup of any country since Nazi Germany. It's churning out warships and ammunition at an extremely rapid rate. You see that reflected in a huge increase in the military budget. So China still claims it only spends about $230 billion a year. American intelligence suggests it's almost 3 times that amount. That's been backed up by think tanks that basically find things that other countries put in their military budgets that China has been leaving out to make its budget look smaller. But when you factor those things in, you see a major increase in the budget. And you can also just see the results of this military investment with things that you can see with your own eyes. So the number of warships that are coming out of Chinese shipyards has surged in recent years. China is doubling the size of its nuclear arsenal. And increasingly, China is deploying these military assets in more aggressive ways than it used to. And I think this all reflects a basic calculation that China can no longer rely on economic carrots to get other countries to give it concessions. And so it's more willing to start using military sticks to try to coerce compliance. So in the Taiwanese case, China used to hope that the Taiwanese would eventually just unify with the mainland through trade and investment links and tourism, that eventually the Taiwanese would come back, but that has failed, and so now China is sustaining the largest military show of force in the Taiwan Strait in more than a generation. To really underscore that, China has built full-scale models of Taiwanese and American military bases out in the desert, as well as full-scale models of American aircraft carriers, so that Chinese forces can do practice bombing raids on those mock military vessels. You're seeing something similar happening in the South China Sea. So this is a heat map that the New York Times put together that shows just from 2021 to 2023, the increase in the density of Chinese naval and maritime militia operations. A lot of these are concentrating around disputed features in the South China Sea, and they're not just increasing the presence. China's just gotten much more aggressive in the way that it uses these naval and maritime militia vessels. So especially the Philippines has really come in for a lot of coercion just over the last year, where China, blasting Filipino ships with water cannons and lasers, boarding Filipino ships literally with knives drawn. And so you're just seeing a greater willingness to court risk, and you're also seeing something similar happening on the border with India, where you've had a number of skirmishes, some of which have actually killed several dozen troops. So it just seems like across the board, China is much more willing to try to extend its security perimeter, even having to use force to shove its way to carve out space for itself in what it views as an increasingly hostile world. The last part of this, and what also worries me, is just that China, in addition to building up its own military, has been working increasingly with other autocratic revisionist powers, most notably, obviously, Putin's war in Ukraine, sustaining that by providing critical components. China recently reaffirmed its alliance with North Korea, and then with Iran, really giving it an economic lifeline. There was a massive infusion of Chinese investment recently, at the same time that China sold Iran a bunch of weapons. And so, again, the strategy here seems to be what political scientists call external balancing. There's internal balancing, where you try to counter your adversary by building up from within your own military forces, your own power. But if you can't catch up, then what you can do is external balancing. So I'm just going to get allies to help me do some of that dirty work. And so it seems like China, by cultivating these partners and helping them foment conflict at various points around Eurasia, is stretching Western forces thin. It's also just gaining military technology. So Russia is giving China a quieting technology for its submarines, stealth technology for its aircraft, early warning systems, et cetera. So you're seeing these autocratic links. Some people call it an axis. I think it gives it too much credit. I don't think it's quite on the level of like a full-fledged military alliance, but certainly it's a beneficial partnership as far as these guys are concerned. So naturally, all of this is fueling conflict with the United States. And unfortunately, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. Part of that, again, is based on history. So there's been, over the last 200 years, there's been 27 great power rivalries. And these cases really only wound down not with the two sides talking their way out and kind of figuring out how they're going to divide up parts of the world, but only after one side basically loses the ability to compete, only after there's a major shift in the balance of power that forces one side to basically make major concessions. And unfortunately, in the vast majority of these cases, that just comes through a massive war where one side beats the other into submission. There's like the Soviet case, the Cold War, where the Soviets just run out of gas and have to sell out through peaceful exhaustion, but that's not the norm. And when you look at the fundamental problem is that it's what political scientists call a credible commitment problem, meaning making concessions to the other side that are big enough to reassure the other side, also give the other side a huge advantage, strategic advantage, that you have no idea if they're going to exploit it or not, and they can't really credibly promise not to exploit it. So like you look at something like Taiwan, and the Americans say, China, lay off Taiwan, stop all that aggression. And the Chinese say, yeah, if we do that, the Taiwanese are probably going to drift further and further towards independence. We have to threaten them in order to keep them in line. Why don't you, the United States, stop selling arms to Taiwan? But the Americans say, okay, yeah, if we do that, then the military balance is going to shift more in your favor, and that just makes an invasion or a blockade even more likely. So there's lots of examples like that where a lot of the main issues in US-China relations are not what the Chinese call win-win. They're essentially zero-sum. You know, you can either govern Taiwan from Taipei or Beijing, not both. The South China Sea can be Chinese territorial waters or international waters. Russia can be ground down or propped back up, and so on. So it's just very hard to walk all of this out. Now, I am cautiously optimistic that in 10, maybe 20 years, just based on the trends I showed you now, there's a possibility that China won't be able to sustain the level of military investment and international expansion that we're currently seeing. I don't think Xi Jinping would be willing to really dial back his ambitions, but he's 71 years old. Presumably he'll move on at some point. And I could see the next round of China's leaders, if they're faced with a declining power ratio to the United States and its allies, having to come back and re-bargain, essentially. And there is a potential bargain, I think, that could be had to resolve a lot of the tension between the United States and China, really between the West and China in general, which is basically peace and economic access. So you go back to that bargain. It's really the bargain that Germany, Japan, France, United Kingdom, all these mighty empires took, which is we're going to forego our dreams of regional dominance and territorial acquisition, and in exchange we get tremendous economic access to the whole Western network. We basically get security guarantees, and our people are better off for it. So I could see something like that happening between the United States and China somewhere down the line, but I think you're going to have this shift in the balance of power first. I think the most likely scenario is that China runs out of gas for all those economic reasons I gave, but it could be, we just had the debate. I didn't see how it went between Harris and Trump, but if the United States tears itself apart and just collapses, well then that's a shift in the balance of power, and maybe that'll get resolved in China's favor. The bottom line is something big is going to happen for us to break this deadlock. But the good news is, in the meantime, a Cold War between the United States and China doesn't have to go hot. And there are in fact fringe benefits to a Cold War. You could have a relatively tense but stable situation where, ironically, the two sides in sort of a space race dynamic push each other to innovate faster, and as a result, humans get better AI and better climate change reducing technologies, and all other kinds of good things come out of this competitive dynamic between two of the leading states in the international system. So we are going to have a Cold War for now. The bad news is I think we're entering a moment of maximum danger just because of where China is in its life cycle as a great power. But if we can make it through these terrible 20s, I think we can be cautiously optimistic we'll get to a better place maybe in 10 years. So on that happy note, thank you so much, and I hope to see you all at the dinner later tonight. Appreciate it.